Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and it's Tuesday, which means we are doing another tier list. So the last couple weeks we've done our meta deck tier list where we rank all of the best decks in the current metagame based off all their matchups and everything that's going on in this particular format. What decks are the best ones to play? We've been kind of keeping up to date. However, this will be the third one of Spacetime Smackdown, and because of that, I believe this is going to be my final meta deck tier list of this format. I think things have finally kind of come around full circle, basically, since the start of Spacetime Smackdown. We've seen a lot of things develop and a lot of things change. So we're gonna go ahead. We're gonna rank all of the decks here in the format. This is really all of the decks that people are playing competitively in tournaments. If you don't have a deck, if there's a deck on here that maybe you don't think is good, or if you think I'm missing a deck here on the tier list, let me know. But overall, this is basically every deck. There's 30-something decks here that are all the most common decks in the format. So let's get right into it. This will be our final tier list. Things have come around full circle, but things have also really settled in. I believe that at this point, we have a really good understanding of what the best decks are, how they all interact, and really where they should be going on the tier list. So this is going to be my final Spacetime Smackdown tier list. Okay, that was a long intro. Let's get right into it. So first and foremost, I think what we're going to do is we're gonna let's just go in this random order, basically. We're gonna do Articuno first. Now, I actually really like Articuno decks. You can play it a bunch of different ways. Like you can play just the straight 18 trainer Articuno deck, which is actually, funnily enough, one of the highest win rate decks in the format. In fact, all of the only 18 trainer decks, whether it's Articuno or Pachirisu, have some of the highest average win rates across everything in the format. However, they haven't been played super significantly. The cool thing about Articuno, I say cool even though it's probably the annoying thing about Articuno, is that you can just absolutely get lucky and flip heads on Misties or Misty turn one and end up just sort of winning the game just like that. It's a little bit less consistent in its overall strategy than Pachirisu. However, you do have that high roll potential to just win the game, which can be really, really frustrating. Guaranteeing to start with Articuno can be good. Again, unfortunately, there are a lot of other really fast decks in the format. We're weak to electric, which is kind of bad, but it's kind of still surprising to me that Articuno still has such a high win rate. Again, I think that Cyrus makes this particular deck that much better, makes Articuno that much better. I like Articuno. Again, its win rate's pretty good. I mean, it hasn't topped any tournaments per se, but it always has a really good win rate, and it always kind of floats above the top, within the top 64 or whatnot. It always places pretty high. We're gonna go ahead and put Articuno in the A tier. I don't think it's honestly that bad. I think it's kind of fringe A, B tier, but I think it does actually deserve to be in the A tier because, again, I'm also pairing in the Articuno variant where you're also playing Palkia and maybe you're playing Manaphy. So really, Articuno decks in general is kind of what this particular deck here. I don't know what we're going to pull up on screen. We'll have to see. I'll find, the most recent highest placing Articuno deck. But basically, for now, all of the Articuno decks wrapped up into sort of one archetype, whether it's the 18 trainers or with Palkia, Manaphy, or Starmie, whatever it is. I think they belong in the A tier. Again, I just think that Articuno is much better with Cyrus, and I think that it's just a pretty good card in the format right now, and most of the Articuno decks actually have really good win rates. And next up is going to be Aerodactyl and Lucario. So it's been a little while since we've seen Aerodactyl really do well. It actually kind of popped off somewhat recently. The problem with fighting type decks right now is that in Aerodactyl specifically is that we have 140 HP and we're weak to Magnezone, which does hit for 110. Most Magnezone decks are either playing Darkrai, or they're playing Skarmory, or they're playing the Hitmonlee fighting package. So it's very likely that our Aerodactyl will likely kind of get damaged, further also than just the Magnezone attacking it. So Magnezone hitting for weakness on it for 130, whether it's the Darkrai ping or it's a Hitmonlee kind of, kick on the bench or, something rather, there's gonna be some extra damage modifiers, which kind of really puts Aerodactyl in a really tough space. I just don't think the format's really kind to it. It is unfortunate that Aerodactyl does have a weakness, I should say, to electric, which again isn't great. Electric type is probably the best typing in the game. Magnezones are everywhere, so being a fighting deck that's weak to electric doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Even though those electric cards are weak to fighting, it doesn't really matter because, again, Magnezone has more HP. It's got 140 rather, so the same as Aerodactyl, but it does more damage on average. And there's not a really great lead off here. Yes, you can play Hitmonlee in the deck, but overall, I just don't think Aerodactyl really shined that much in this format. I think the Primeape Law effect is actually quite strong. However, if you really think about the format right now, there's a lot of basic Pokemon that are just sort of doing their thing. Yes, technically you can stop an Exeggcute from evolving. That could be pretty clutch, but they're going to evolve before you can probably evolve your Aerodactyl anyway. Fossils are good, however, they're only good in certain scenarios. Other than that, they're actually kind of a downside. I'm going to put Aerodactyl and Lucario in the B tier. I think I had it A tier in previous weeks, but I think we've kind of seen how the fighting decks have wrapped up this format, and there really isn't that many of them that are going to be high on the list here. But for Aerodactyl and Lucario, we're going to go ahead and we're going to put it in the B tier. And next up, we have Exeggutor with Celebi. I don't really need to talk about this particular archetype very much. This is going to go into the S tier. In fact, this, in my mind, is the #1 deck of Spacetime Smackdown. Arguably, Celebi with Jungle Totem and Serperior and Exeggutor last format, in the Mythical Island format, was actually potentially the #1 deck of last format. I think a lot of people thought Gyarados was the #1 deck, but Celebi actually had more first place finishes than any other deck of last format. So I think Grass type in general is just really strong, but I think it really chalks down to Exeggutor. We're playing the deck much differently now than we did before, but I think Exeggutor benefits from all of the format changes since Spacetime Smackdown was released more than any other Pokemon in the game potentially, with Pokemon Communications, with Giant Cape, with Cyrus, everything, basically. The way that the game is played now, the way people are building decks, very, very strong setup for Exeggutor. It's absolutely dominated, and it didn't win this past week. It did win the week before. Not necessarily with Celebi, it won with the Yanmega, but it's been getting top 4 of the last few weeks, and it's absolutely dominated. About 50% of the decks that made it into top cut of this last weekend's Ursa Days tournament were literally Exeggutor decks. This is the best version of Exeggutor, in my opinion. We're going to go ahead and put it in the S tier very, very comfortably. And next up is Celebi. Unfortunately, again, I just don't think that this is a good way to play Celebi right now. The format is a little bit too fast-paced. So this version of Celebi is, again, with Jungle Totem Superior. It's more of a late-game focused Celebi deck. The format right now is not very kind to late-game setup sweep decks. Unfortunately, unless you're playing something like a Charizard, there's just not that many revenge attackers in the game. Celebi does get KO'd by a lot of Pokemon in the format. There's also a lot of extra damage modifiers with Rocky Helmet, things like that just put Celebi within range of getting KO'd. And if Celebi is getting one hit KO'd, it's not very useful because, again, you're not going to get more than one attack off. And again, it's fairly slow. Yes, we do have Pokemon Communications, which technically does make Serperior a little bit more consistent. But overall, I think that this is by far a lot slower and just a lot less good overall. I think we would rather just play this Exeggutor and just, manually kind of attack with 4 or 5 energies on Celebi in the late game while having a much more consistent early game. So yeah, this deck hasn't really seen much play. It also hasn't seen much success. It's going to go into the C tier. But again, Celebi and Exeggutor are good cards. It's just I don't think the Jungle Totem strategy is really the way to go right now. And next up is going to be Darkrai and Greninja. In fact, we have all of the Darkrai decks right here. So this is interesting to me. Again, because things still go up and down, right? I have, we're doing a tier list today, but, after, this last weekend's tournament, you could say that Celebi isn't an S tier pick or Exeggutor is not an S tier pick because of all of the counterplay that is going to form around it. But this is more of an objective tier list and not so much a subjective tier list of the particular moment in time right now. This is really just overall what the best decks are for this format, right? Just from at a glance, right? From a high, 50,000 foot view right now. And I do think that these decks are going to fall where they will basically for the rest of this format, which is really only a couple weeks long. But next up, we have Darkrai and Greninja, all of the Darkrai decks. And these are really interesting because I honestly think that they're all really, really strong. They all have their place. I think, unfortunately, the counter meta to Exeggutor right now isn't as kind to Greninja and Darkrai as we sort of initially thought. This is more of a kind of a stall-based, a little bit more of a passive damage deck that really enjoys our opponent not being super confrontational to us early in the game or just building something up that's super, super strong. Really, any deck that flows in the middle, Darkrai, Greninja, and Druddigon has a really good matchup with. Unfortunately, though, I think how the format has kind of ended up basically being heavy Magnezone, being heavy Exeggutor, and heavy Charizard to counter those Exeggutors, it really hasn't put Greninja in a great spot, even though I do think that overall it's a better deck than the Magnezone variant of Darkrai. I don't think that the format was as kind to it. This is going to go into the A tier. I still think it's a very, very good deck. I think it deserves to be played. However, I'm not going to put it in the S tier, even though I did the last couple weeks I thought that this version of Darkrai would really rise to prominence, but the way that the meta has formulated basically around Exeggutor and Celebi, I don't think it's as kind to Darkrai and Greninja. Its matchup spreads are better overall, but the decks that are seeing more play are just unfortunately do well against Darkrai and Greninja. And next up is going to be Darkrai and Magnezone. So in my mind, still a very, very strong deck here. I could put it in the A tier and I could put it in the S tier. I have my reasons for both. However, what I will say is that for some reason, even though Magnezone is by far the most common, it's one of the most common cards in the entire format, there's still a lot of people that are playing water decks. They're still playing Palkia, they're still playing Articuno, they're still playing Gyarados. Decks that are weak to electric, and that's really, I think, the one thing that's carrying Magnezone, even though it does not have a good Exeggutor matchup whatsoever, it actually does still counter a lot of the decks that people are playing other than Exeggutor. And those decks, again, being, Gyarados, and they're being Charizard, and just really all of these other water decks that are still seeing a lot of play. And that's the thing. Electric is just the best type in the game, in my opinion. It hits so many things for weakness. Even Aerodactyl, as we talked about, is weak to electric, but also Yanmega. I mean, Magnezone basically has gatekept Yanmega from being super relevant in the format because Yanmega is also weak to electric, which is just crazy. So many good Pokemon weak to the electric type, not only Zapdos, but Moltres as well. A big reason why we're strong against the Charizard matchup. So I think that from a typing perspective has really carried this version of Darkrai, and I think that's really what's carrying Magnezone overall. But if I had to really rank a deck right now in this particular format, I do think that the Magnezone and Darkrai is going to be the best way to play Darkrai, in my honest opinion. And next up is going to be Darkrai and Weavile. This is going in the S tier. I didn't say that, but S tier. That's where we're kind of settling this for the format here. Again, this is my final tier list, so I'm not changing this. This is exactly where it's going to be, and I want it to remain in the S tier because I do think it belongs. I think it's the second most played deck of the format, and has consistently stayed about 53 to 54% win rate, which is really pretty phenomenal if you really think about it. I think as more people are playing Exeggutor over the next couple weeks, that's going to go down. Probably it's going to settle around 52 to 53%, but we'll have to see. Either way, still an S tier deck. Next up is Darkrai and Weavile. So this was the version that I actually thought would be really, really good originally. The thing with Darkrai and Weavile is that it's just, again, the format did not shape up in a way that was kind to it. Grass decks became just the most popular decks, that being, of course, Exeggutor and Celebi. Still one of the most potent, I guess, strong, explosive, early game, combo-based decks in the game. I think it's really, really good. In fact, I think if there wasn't so much grass running around, if Exeggutor wasn't the most prominent Pokemon in this format, Weavile and Darkrai would actually be, in my mind, one of the best decks in the entire game. Similar to how Palkia would have been also one of the best decks in the game, had it not been just surrounded by Magnezones from day one. So unfortunately, I think Darkrai and Weavile has to go into the A tier. I think overall power, it could be knocking on the S tier door, but the format just hasn't been super kind to it. Exeggutor running rampant, and all of our Pokemon are weak to dark, or grass. So unfortunately, it's going to go into the A tier. And then we have Darkrai and Weezing. I'm just going to go ahead and put Darkrai Weezing in the B tier. It saw a little bit more play early on. It's not a bad deck. The cool thing about Weezing is it's not weak to grass. It's weak to fighting. So I guess you have that upside, but still, it's not proactive enough. It's not a lot of damage. Again, I think if we're going to be playing a more passive-aggressive version of Darkrai, we would rather play the Greninja Dredagon variant, and if we wanted to play a more proactive version of Darkrai, we should probably just be playing the Magnezone variant. So Weezing doesn't really do either of those things as good as the other decks. Basically, if I had to put it if you're thinking about a more offensive Darkrai deck, I think you have Magnezone or Weavile. And then if you had a more defensive Darkrai deck, you have Greninja and Weezing. But basically, I think Weezing's worse than Greninja at that. And like I said, I think Magnezone is better than Weavile at being aggressive. So it's going to go into the B tier. I think it's still good. Darkrai just carries. Weezing's not a bad card. And like I said, you're not necessarily weak to grass, but you are getting 2-hit KO'd most likely by an Exeggutor, which can feel bad for sure, especially if you don't draw into those Kogas. Exeggutor is just going to heal, so it's not really good, I don't think, into the format right now. But it's just going to go into the B tier, and I feel pretty good about that. And next up, we have Dialga. In fact, let's just knock out all of the Dialga decks. And unfortunately for Dialga, it had a pretty decent early game or early format showing. It was, again, one of the more common decks earlier on in the format, but just didn't end up being anything substantial. I never thought Dialga was going to be a meta card, at least once I saw all of the cards that we had to pair with it. By far, the best version of Dialga is going to be sort of this counter meta version with Yanmega EX and Mew EX. It's pretty good, honestly, in the format. Its win rate has remained, honestly, one of the highest win rates in the entire game. It doesn't have a ton of, high upside, so it's kind of the opposite of something like a Charizard, where it's very consistent. And it doesn't lose very easily, but it doesn't win super easily either. So very kind of low downside, but pretty low upside as well. I'm actually going to put it into the A tier. These are not in order so far. But Dialga and Yanmega, I do believe, is an A tier deck where, again, one of the highest win rates out of any deck in the format. But unfortunately, I think as things are going right now, it's just not perfect. There's too much. I don't know. It's just not fast enough, and I think that the format right now is fairly fast. There's still a lot of Palkia, there's still a lot of Charizard, a lot of decks that really just completely wall Dialga, even though it does have a pretty good matchup against some, of the Darkrai decks and some other decks in the format as well. But the win rate alone, even though it's kind of fallen off in play pretty drastically, is going to land it into the A tier pretty comfortably. But unfortunately, the other Dialga decks, I think, are both going to have to go into the C tier. They haven't really done anything prominent. I know some people might be upset about like the Melmetal and Licky Licky versions of Dialga. We really haven't seen enough Licky Licky Dialga to really categorize it properly. That's my opinion. The sample size is pretty small, but again, if people aren't playing it, how are we going to rank it? That's really what it comes down to. These ads here, by the way, are terrible. I don't know how to get rid of them. But I have ad blocker. It's not working. But yeah, so the other versions of Dialga, they don't see a lot of play. Melmetal is at like a 40% win rate. It's just a bad deck. I know some people like it. It's just not a good deck. And then Licky Licky, I think, is a bit better than Dialga, or better than Melmetal, rather. Maybe it could go into the B tier, but we haven't seen enough play, so I mean, it doesn't really matter. I just don't think it's really a B tier deck. I don't think it's as good as the Darkrai Weezing or Aerodactyl Lucario deck. So I'm going to go ahead and put the other two Dialgas here into the C tier. Unfortunately, I know some people really love Dialga. Well, we did, this is just a side note, but I did multiple polls on my my YouTube community page, basically at the beginning of the format and before the set came out, asking which card is better, Palkia or Dialga, and everybody was still super high on Dialga. They always thought it was going to be a good card, and I just really didn't. I did not think that Dialga was ever going to be that good, but I don't know. That's just my opinion. I wonder if people still think that way. Again, I mean, I guess this Dialga is actually pretty good with Yanmega EX. Dialga's not a bad card, just not that many good cards to pair with it, but yeah, that's where I'm putting the Dialga decks right now. I think, again, this version of Dialga really does get carried by Mew EX and Yanmega as sort of counter meta picks, but it's just going to go ahead and fall into the A tier. The others we're going to keep into the C tier. Okay, we're going to have to move a little bit more quickly now. We've talked about most of the heavy hitters. In fact, for the decks that don't see a lot of play, we're not going to talk too much about them, but let's move on. So this is Exeggutor and Mew EX. So in my previous week's basically tier list, I put this in the S tier, and I still want to put it in the S tier, but the problem is that I don't think most people are ever going to play Exeggutor EX with Mew EX. Yes, it's going to drastically help your matchups against a lot of the counter picks that people are playing to counter Exeggutor. It's going to help you in the Gyarados matchup and the Charizard matchup and a few others as well, maybe Palkia as well. So it's really good for that late game consistency to have that really strong revenge attacker, but I think for the overall early game consistency of the deck, which is what most people are really focused on when they're playing Exeggutor, Mew EX is drastically going to reduce that. It brings the chances that you're either starting with Exeggutor or Execute or Celebi down pretty significantly. And if we're playing Mew EX, we probably have to play something like an X-Speed, which again cuts out some other really useful trainer cards from the deck. So I think there's a lot of reasons why I think this could be an S tier pick for the metagame currently, like in the current moment. But I think overall, from a format perspective, I think this has to just go into the A tier. I don't think it's seen enough play, and it hasn't had enough success, even though the average win rate for this deck is potentially higher than any other deck in the format. It just hasn't seen enough success or enough play for me to warrant putting it in the S tier, but I do think it's a very, very strong deck. It's still Exeggutor Celebi. It's still really, really good, but again, I just can't really put it in the S tier, so it's going to go into the A tier for now. Next up, we have the Fighting Magnezone variant. So I know I have Marshadow and Magnezone here on the image, but it's really like the Hitmonlee Marshadow package with Magnezone, and I do think that this is a really, really strong deck. If you look at the matchup spreads for this particular deck here, it's absolutely incredible. This deck is super good against basically everything in the format that's not Exeggutor. It beats almost everything. It beats Darkrai decks, it beats Charizard decks, it beats Gyarados decks, drastically beats Gyarados decks. But unfortunately, it just loses to Exeggutor almost all of the time. And that can feel pretty bad. So again, it hasn't seen that much play. It's one of the best counter meta picks in the game right now. If you wanted to counter the counter meta, right? If you wanted to be like an extra step ahead, I think this would be a really great choice. Again, I made a video on it and I called it an anti-meta deck. It confused the whole community, and people had no idea what I was talking about maybe, and I apologize for that. I've already talked about that before, but from a counter meta perspective, if you're trying to counter specific decks at the top of the metagame, this is one of the best decks to do it. Unfortunately, I believe it's not even a top 5 most played deck. It hasn't really, placed extremely well at a lot of large online tournaments. So I think it's really, really good. I think most Magnezone decks are probably going to fall somewhere in the A tier, but I think this deck here is not S tier, at least in my mind. It hasn't done enough, so we're going to go ahead and put it in the A tier. And next up is Gallade. Gallade recently got like top 16 at the Ursa Days tournament, and I actually do like Gallade. I don't think it's bad, but it's hard for me to really put this in the A tier. Like, I do like Gallade, and I think actually right now in the meta is actually a little bit better. If we're playing fighting decks in the meta right now in this current moment with Exeggutor, I think we would rather play more late game, powerful, attacking, more higher HP, stage 2 fighting Pokemon. Things like Machamp, like Gallade, like Rampardos, things like that. So I think it's actually pretty good in the current metagame, but overall, I can't put Gallade EX in the A tier. It just doesn't hang with the other decks that are in A tier, so it's going to go into the B tier. Again, I do think it's a good deck. I don't think it's necessarily top of the metagame, but I think it's very comparable to something like Lucario and Aerodactyl, or even Darkrai Weezing in terms of its overall viability, so it's going to fall into the B tier. I do like Gallade. B tier is not bad, by the way. Like, you got to understand, like, we're ranking the top 30, like, most played archetypes, and if you're in the B tier, like, you're a solid sort of meta deck. Like, you're not, you know, like super good. You're not like the most commonly played deck in the format, but you are still a very, very solid deck. So if you see any of the decks that you like to play in the B tier or even the C tier, like, it doesn't mean they're bad whatsoever. It just means, you know, they're not like at the very, you know, top. They're not the cream of the crop. So Gallade's going to go into the B tier, and I feel pretty good about that. Again, as a final placement for this format, I do think Gallade in the B tier makes sense. And next we have Garchomp. I didn't change the image because originally people were playing Garchomp with like Manaphy and stuff, but now people are playing it with like Druddigon and a couple other different ways. So even though this has Manaphy on the image, this is really just all Garchomp decks. And again, I don't think Garchomp is terrible, but its win rates have been just pretty low. It has some decent placements in some smaller tournaments, much like all of these decks in B and C tier do. But I don't think it's nearly as good as the other decks in B tier. So it's going to go into the C tier now pretty comfortably. Again, I don't think it's a terrible deck, but you just can't compare it to the other decks here, you know, at the top of the metagame. I think it has its upsides. The cool thing about Garchomp is it's not weak to anything. 150 is a pretty good number. However, with Giant Cape running around, a lot of Pokemon are outside of that range, and we don't have a lot of extra damage modifiers that we can run with it other than Cynthia. So 150 is a good number, but it's not super great. Also, the ability on Garchomp isn't as good as like you would think, right? I mean, by the time we get Garchomp out, if we're playing Pokemon Communications, it's probably turn 3, turn 4, maybe turn 5. We've gone through most of our deck already. Pokemon Pocket decks are small anyway. There's not a lot of cards that we feel good discarding anyway. So moving through our deck in the late game doesn't necessarily help a ton, although it can come in clutch. It's just not a super strong ability. Also, dual energy decks are never going to be that consistent. There's always the odds that you just literally don't get the other type of energy. You just get one energy, either it's fighting or water, and when that happens, you lose, and that's it. I mean, it's the same with Dragonite. It's more consistent than Dragonite because it's less energies, but the concept still applies. There's always the odds that you get unlucky and just aren't able to attack, and that just makes the deck worse no matter how you look at it. And that's probably why from a win rate perspective, it's just lower. And that's always the case with these multi-energy attackers, dragon-type attackers, basically. And Garchomp is probably the best one that we have right now, but still, I would say C tier pretty comfortably. And next is going to be Infernape, which I actually am going to be putting in the B tier. So I like Infernape. I can't put it next to Gallade. Oh, there we go. So I like Infernape. In fact, I think that right now it's actually found a pretty comfortable place in the metagame, sort of as that ancillary fighting, or ancillary, I guess, fire type deck. That does have a good Exeggutor matchup and is fairly decent across the metagame. It's fairly consistent. It's a little bit more better pacing rather than Charizard, but the upside just isn't nearly as high. And if we're playing a stage 2 Pokemon, and if we're playing fire type, I think Charizard is the best pick. The win rate for Infernape isn't really high. In fact, the overall win rate for Infernape is still lower than Charizard, but I think that it's not a terrible deck here. I think, again, comparing Infernape to Gallade is actually very, very comparable. I think they're both fine decks. And you do have the Dawn combination fire. Again, we are hitting Exeggutor for weakness, but the thing is, Exeggutor with Giant Cape is still living an attack from Infernape, which is bad. That's quite bad, and it just sucks for Infernape. So yeah, I mean, I like it, but I can't put it in the A tier. That's really all it comes down to. So Infernape is going to go into the B tier. Not a bad deck, like I said. And next, we do have like the Mesprit. I put this on here because it is technically an archetype. It has to go into the D tier. It's seen almost no success. It's got one of the lowest win rates out of any of the decks here on the format, or in the tier list rather. I put it on here because, again, I mean, people asked about it. It is a deck that people play sometimes. It just isn't good. It just needs more support. Yes, like there's a lot of Darkrai running around, but in general, most decks just beat it because it doesn't do anything better than really any other deck does. It's less consistent, low HP. It's not super fast paced or anything like that. So it's just not good. I mean, I wish it was better, but it really isn't. So I don't have much to talk about with Mesprit. It just hasn't done anything. You know, I don't know. Like I wouldn't have included this on the tier list, but I know some people ask about it, so we're gonna go ahead and put it in the D tier. That's just the reality of things. And next up, we actually have Luxray and Electivire, which is not a D tier deck, funnily enough. This is a C tier deck. It floats around a 45 to 46% win rate, which is, again, higher than all of the decks that are below it here. It's a lot better than you might expect it to be, and better than I ever expected it to be. But in my playtesting, limited playtesting of Luxray, I think it's actually a pretty good card. And there's actually, I think, a pretty significant, like, I guess, chance that, you know, later in the metagame, if electric-type decks become more prominent, or decks that, you know, do heavy bench damage, just become better for whatever the reason, I think Luxray is actually going to be a very impactful card, or has the chance to be very impactful in the format. So, again, I don't know what specific lists people are falling on. I think really anything with Luxray is what this particular image will fall under, but I do think that it's actually a C tier deck. I don't think it's bad. It really isn't that bad. And next we have Mismagius, which again is interesting to me. There's a few ways that people have played Mismagius. Again, it's hard to say. We're going to bundle them all into one particular deck here. I don't know if I really want to put it in the B tier, but I kind of do though. Like I kind of do want to put Mismagius in the B tier because it has a pretty decent win rate overall. Whether you're playing it with like Mew EX and Sigilyph, or maybe you're just playing it with Togekiss, like the Togekiss deck actually has some decent win rates in some smaller tournaments. It's placed fairly high. Some people are just playing Mismagius with Magnezone as well. So to be honest, in the smaller tournaments, this deck actually has some pretty prominent you know, results. And I think a big reason for that is because people actually have played it. Like, it's one of the new cards. People like Psychic. Mewtwo EX is bad. So people kind of have moved on to like Mismagius as sort of this really off-meta like rogue pick that sometimes does actually pretty well because it's really not a bad deck. It is RNG dependent with its you know, status condition. So I mean, I don't know. I think I have to put it in the B tier. Maybe it's C tier. Do I put Mismagius in the B tier? Is it as good as the other decks in the B tier, I suppose, is what I'm wondering. Man, it really is close. Like, it's either B or C tier, but I think I am going to put it in the B tier later on when we organize our list. We'll probably put it low B tier, but I actually think it's had enough results and enough play for me to warrant not putting it in the C tier. I think it has deserved a B tier slot, at least on our tier list. So, yeah, shout out to Mismagius. Next is going to be Pachirisu, and Pachirisu is an A tier deck, very similarly to Articuno. Again, one of the highest average win rates out of any deck in the format, basically. The upside, it's not super high, but the downside is really low. Basically guaranteed to do 80 damage on turn 2, and every turn basically from then on out. If you get lucky drawing enough Sabrinas or Cyruses or things like that in the early game, and if you hit the right matchups, you're going to do pretty good. It doesn't have terrible matchups against really anything across the board. It can't struggle against sort of the healing factor and high HP of Exeggutor. But overall, I think it's so consistent that having basically a 55 or 56% win rate is extremely good, even though it's not necessarily one of the top 10 or top 5 most played decks in the format. It hasn't won anything, but it actually always consistently gets like top 32 or top 16 at even the largest online tournaments. So Pachirisu definitely has to go into the A tier. I think as far as like pure electric type decks go, it really is one of the best decks in the game right now. And it's really honestly taken the place of Pikachu EX, which again has fallen off dramatically, I think, for a variety of different reasons. But Pachirisu, I believe, is actually kind of the better option than Pikachu right now. And now we're going to move on to the Palkia decks. So Palkia and Vaporeon. Some people are really going to question me here. This is where I might lose some people, and I'm sure I'm going to get some comments, but Palkia is going in the S tier. I've kept it in the S tier basically this entire format, and here's my justification. Like, yes, this is a meta tier list, and yes, we're ranking decks based on how good they are in the metagame. One thing you got to keep in mind is that we're playing an encounter Exeggutor format right now. Yes, there's a lot of Magnezone still flying around, but there's a lot of Charizard flying around, and there's a lot of Darkrai flying around that isn't with Magnezone and things like that. Palkia is literally one of the strongest decks in the entire game. One thing I don't think people realize is that one of the main reasons why Magnezone and Darkrai and any Magnezone deck really became exceedingly popular early on in this format was because of Palkia. It was the #1 most played deck week 1, and it's remained in the top 5 most played decks over the last 3 weeks. It's consistently, even with all of the Magnezone decks being played over the last 3 weeks, it's remained at about a 52% win rate, which is absolutely ridiculous for a deck that is basically heavily countered by almost every deck in the format right now, because Magnezone is so popular. So yeah, it's really kind of the original, pure meta cards that the sort of the counter meta was formulated around. Again, it's literally the reason why Magnezone and Darkrai became popular, and why it did so well in that first week. It's still really, really strong. I wouldn't be surprised if Palkia and Vaporeon actually ended up winning in one of these last couple weeks of the format. I have to put it in the S tier. Anybody that's played this deck, I know it's, again, like I said, not super perfectly placed in the format right now. Anybody that's tested and played this deck knows how absolutely ridiculous it is. Cyrus, it's so good. Basically guaranteed to get 2 attacks off with Palkia, or at least 1 if our Palkia doesn't get revenge KO'd. Giant Cape is so good in the deck. Basically, it's just so good. It does exactly what you want it to. It's very linear, but very consistent overall. One of my favorite decks, and again, one of the strongest decks in the entire game right now. And it has to go in the S tier. I mean, it really does. I know some people just don't agree with that, but it has to go into the S tier because it's so good. Now, Palkia and Greninja, I've never been super high on it. It's hard for me to like put it in the A tier because its win rate is much lower than a lot of the other water type decks. Palkia and Articuno is much higher from a win rate perspective and a play rate perspective. Also, Gyarados is just better, so it's gonna go into the B tier. It's not a bad deck. Again, it's just water, Misties, Greninja, Druddigon. It's not bad. It's totally fine. But again, it's just not as good as the other water decks that are above it from a success standpoint, placing standpoint, and also a of course, a win rate perspective. So it's going to go into the B tier. And next we have Pikachu, which unfortunately also I think it has to go into either the B or the C tier. Like, Pikachu really has fallen off. In fact, I am actually going to put Pikachu in the C tier, and a main reason for that is because I think that there's other decks that do the same thing as Pikachu but really outshine it. As far as these tempo decks go, Exeggutor absolutely completely took over the tempo metagame. Pachirisu is really the replacement for Pikachu in this format. It does basically everything that Pikachu did, but more consistently and just better now. So there's really no reason to play Pikachu, even though the Zebstrika bench damage can be really useful in this current format. I think Pikachu isn't a terrible deck, so like I could possibly put it in the B tier, but the thing is nobody plays it anymore. So I'm kind of gonna disrespect Pikachu, even though I do think from a actual quality perspective it probably does belong in the B tier. Nobody plays it anymore, and it's been absolutely replaced by other things, so it's got to go into the C tier because nobody plays it. Nobody plays Pikachu anymore, and it just hasn't done anything, so it's got to find its way into the C tier. Next up is Primeape. Again, nobody really plays Primeape either. I thought that it would actually be one of the more significant cards to pair with Lucario, and it's actually, again, it can be really good with Giant Cape because it puts us at 100 HP and it puts us at a range of Exeggutor. The problem is that it doesn't matter if we're hitting for 70 damage on turn 2. It just doesn't, because there's most likely going to be an Exeggutor there, and you're gonna die. You're just gonna get knocked out. You're not gonna do enough damage. They have potions in their hand. They have Ericas in their hand. It's not good. I wish it was better, but the way that the format ended up, the way that Exeggutor took over the format, Primeape just didn't really have a place, and unfortunately, that's just the case. I don't know what else to call, what happened to Primeape. I think that it's still a good partner with Lucario, but it's got to go into the C tier. It's just not really a deck that anyone has really played. But now we have Rampardos in Lucario, and this is actually going to go into the A tier. Again, these are not in order, but as far as like pure fighting decks go, in my mind, this is actually the most successful fighting deck of this format. We have Hitmonlee, we have Marshadow, we have Lucario, we have Rampardos. It's really kind of a pile deck, but I think Rampardos is as well positioned in this format as any other deck. It does a lot of damage. Again, it's a basic, it's not a basic, but it's a fossil Pokemon, which means we're never leading off with the fossils, so it can be a little bit of a dead draw, but again, we have the Hitmonlee Marshadow combo with Lucario on the back line. Until we get Rampardos set up, it's really a late game sweeper option. I think that's the best way to play fighting decks right now. It had more success early in the format. Fighting has pretty much fallen off, but again, if we're looking at this format as a total, as a whole right now, I do think that this version of Rampardos in Lucario is actually probably an A tier deck. It's probably going to go lower A tier once we put everything in order, but it is still, I believe, better than the other decks in the B tier. It has more success than the other decks in the B tier, so that's why we're going to go ahead and put it in the A tier. And next we have Gyarados. And here's the thing, guys. Do we really, like, are we going to put Gyarados in the A tier? Here's the thing. I don't really want to put Gyarados in the S tier. The reason for that is because I don't think it doesn't have a great win rate. Compared to something like a Palkia EX. Again, very heavily countered by certain things in the format. There's still quite a bit of Hitmonlee floating around. Hitmonlee almost always destroys Gyarados. And particularly the Magikarps, but therefore also destroying the Gyaradoses. Yes, it technically has a good Celebi matchup, but heavily countered by all of the, Darkrai Magnezone decks, the Pachirisu decks, the Hitmonlee decks. It's just not as good in the format as a counter pick as something like a Charizard EX. So as far as like these water representations go, I cannot put Gyarados in the S tier. Even though it's literally the only water deck to win an Ursa Days tournament, it won the first week of the format. People weren't really fully understanding of what the format entailed and what they should be playing. So unfortunately, I don't think that Gyarados is an A tier pick or S tier pick. I could be wrong about that. Like Charizard won this last week, and Gyarados had the chance to win that week, but it just lost to Charizard. And I think that's really what it kind of comes down to. If you're playing some of these really late game sweeper decks to kind of counter Exeggutor, I think you're going to end up playing, if you're playing Gyarados, you're going to end up playing eventually the Charizard decks, which are also kind of functioning in a very similar spot to you in the format. And therefore, you're probably going to lose because Charizard actually has a winning matchup against Gyarados. And that can feel kind of bad. So that's why Gyarados is going to go into the A tier. I'm probably going to eat my words. Gyarados might end up winning again in the next week and even the week after that before the mini set releases and the format refreshes. And if it does, it'll probably be the only deck of this format to win 2 Ursa Days Pocket Weekly tournaments. So in that case, I would look pretty stupid by putting Gyarados in the A tier, but its win rate is just so low, and I can't justify putting it in the S tier. I think Palkia is better, and I have to go ahead and put Palkia in the S tier, even though it hasn't won and Gyarados has won. I think if we're looking at the viability of the decks overall, since the first week, Gyarados has not been an S tier deck, so we're gonna go ahead and comfortably put it in the A tier. And next up, we have Skarmory and Bastiodon. I don't think this is a bad deck. We're going to put it in the B tier. There's another Skarmory deck that we'll talk about after. Skarmory and Bastiodon isn't bad. The problem is that Bastiodon itself isn't very good. It doesn't do enough damage, and you're just going to get outpaced or just like outlasted by Exeggutors in that matchup. Yes, Skarmory does carry the deck, and yes, we're guaranteed to start with Skarmory, but in the backline, there's just other Pokemon that are better to pair with Skarmory than Bastiodon. I don't think Bastiodon is bad, but it's not great. It only does 80 damage, and yes, we have a lot of HP, but it doesn't matter, because by the time our Bastiodon is attacking, let's say we are playing Exeggutor, we're going against a Celebi that literally has like 6 or 7 energies onto it, and you're just not living. You're just not. And I think that's a big reason why Bastiodon struggles. Also, like, Gyarados is still hitting you for 100 damage plus the weakness if we're weak to fire, which I think we are. So unfortunately, it just hasn't done enough. I don't think it's a bad deck, so I think B tier is a really good spot for Skarmory and Bastiodon. But when we take a look at Skarmory and Magnezone, this is a totally different story. So one of the best decks in the game right now. In fact, I do actually want to put this deck in the S tier. It's kind of risen to popularity recently. Again, kind of taken the format by storm. It does have a pretty volatile and decent matchup against Exeggutor, while also having all of the advantages and benefits to Magnezone. I think both of these cards are very, very good inclusions right now to be playing, at least in the format. I don't know, like, do I really want to put it in the S tier is the question. Because it functions, again, very similarly to things like Darkrai and Magnezone. It's a very similar, like, its placement in the format's very similar. In fact, it just has a little bit worse matchup spreads against the other top decks, but better against Exeggutor. I don't know. Again, I kind of feel a little bit similarly to Gyarados. In fact, this deck has a much higher win rate. It has one of the highest win rates in the format right now. So maybe it does belong in the S tier. I think I put it in S tier last week, and I do think it made... Did it make it to the finals? I think it did. I think it got second place at the recent Ursa Days tournament. You know what? I am actually going to front load this deck on the tier list. I'm going to be a little bit more assumptive, is that a word? With this particular deck. I think that even though it's more of a newer deck, and it hasn't been, or it hasn't really, how do I even explain it? It wasn't really around early on in the format. It's really only been around for the last couple weeks. It is on the rise. It is a very, very good deck. Again, very decent matchup spreads across the format with Magnezone, but Skarmory is just so good. Especially as well being able to KO Exeggutors and things like that early in the game. You know what? I am actually going to put it in the S tier. I feel pretty confidently about that. This is actually my favorite deck to play in this current format. I think Skarmory is just super underrated. I've talked about it. I'm sticking to my guns, honestly, because I talked super high about Skarmory since the very beginning, and I always thought that it would be one of the best decks in the format and in the game. And I think Skarmory is, again, one of the best Pokemon in the game. So I am actually going to put it in the S tier. You guys might disagree with me, but at least wait and see for the next couple weeks to see how this deck does, because I think it has a really good chance to be really one of the top decks of this particular format. And next we have Starmie and Palkia. This saw a little bit more play early on in the format. It's still not bad. It has a very, very decent win rate. It's really just a tempo water deck, very similar to the Articuno variants. It's just not, it's not as good as like the pure Palkia, Manaphy, Vaporeon combination. I think that Starmie is good. I think it can be really good against Exeggutor. 90 damage, we're living in attack. Like, it's not bad. Like, it totals to 180, and that can be really, really good. I like Starmie. I do. I think it kind of gets carried by the whole Palkia Misties thing, personally. But it's a very consistent attacker. It definitely can't go in the S tier, but I think it's too good for me to put it in the B tier, so we're gonna go ahead and put this Starmie, all Starmie decks really, I think we're going to put them in the A tier pretty comfortably, although it has seen a pretty massive decrease in play as time has gone on. Next is going to be Mewtwo EX. I don't have a lot to talk about Mewtwo. Again, about a 40% win rate, a massive drop off from last format. Nobody's really playing it anymore. It's just not good. 150, like, yes, we're weak to Dark, and that's pretty bad, but really 150 in the late game isn't, it's not enough, basically. It's not enough. There's not enough extra damage modifiers that we play in Mewtwo. Really, we're relying on that 150 damage. Yes, we can play Giovanni, but why would we? You know, why would we do that? Why would we play Mewtwo with Giovanni when we could just play Palkia? You know, we could play Darkrai and Magnezone, or we could play Celebi and flip 7 coins at the end of the game. Or if we're not playing those decks, we could just play Charizard and just play Gyarados and do 140 plus, you know, the Greninja, that's 160, or just hit for 200 with Charizard. It's just not good. It's not fast enough. It's not consistent enough, even with Pokemon Communications and Mythical Slab. Just not good enough, unfortunately. And 150 HP isn't really that good either, in my opinion. But yeah, it's got to go in the D tier. It really does. It's done nothing this format, and that's unfortunate for Mewtwo, but it's done nothing. It's just done nothing this format, and we're going to zoom out. There we go. And yeah, its win rate is very far from what it used to be. And next up, we have Venusaur. I do actually like Venusaur. Again, I do think it kind of gets carried by Exeggutor. It has had some decent finishes. Like, I kind of do want to put it in the B tier, just by the simple fact that Grass is really good and Exeggutor is really good. And I do think it's actually seen a little bit more success than these decks here in the C tier, even though it really isn't. Maybe it is just a C tier deck. Yeah, I can't really put it in the B tier with those other guys in B tier. I think the other decks are just better than Venusaur. I do think Venusaur could have been a B tier deck had more people played it. Not enough people really played it, so unfortunately it's going to go right there into the into the C tier. And then next we have Exeggutor and Yanmega. So I actually put this deck in the S tier last week after it had won the Ursa Days tournament and beat the Celebi Exeggutor in the finals. But overall, I think everything has kind of turned out in the sense that Yanmega is not nearly as good as the other Exeggutor decks. It always has a lower win rate. I think that overall, like, Yanmega is a good card, but if we're playing Exeggutor, it's just better to play Celebi. Yanma isn't a good start-off Pokemon. Yanmega can attack unless it has 3 energies, so it's very slow in comparison to something like a Celebi, which can attack on turn 2 with 2 energies and then attack again and again and again and kind of pile up. It's a really good tempo attacker, whereas Yanmega EX is just really useless. So would we rather do 120 on turn 3? That is assuming that we live that long and that we draw into the evolution Pokemon that is Yanmega EX. Or would we rather lead off with Celebi? It's a basic Pokemon, just a little bit less HP, but still 120 HP, and then attack for potentially 50 or 100 damage on turn 2, and then, you know, increase as time goes on. It's just not nearly as good, I don't think, as an early game deck, and I think that's really where Exeggutor does the best, as sort of an aggressive kind of early game, you know, strength deck. And that's why I think Yanmega has to go into the A tier. Like I said, it is literally one of the few decks that have won the Ursa Days tournament this week, similar to, or this format, similar to Gyarados, but I just don't feel comfortable enough for me to put it in the S tier, even though it is Exeggutor and it is really good. I think it's going to be a high A tier deck. That's my opinion. And lastly, fittingly, in fact, very fitting that lastly here, we have Charizard EX. Man, oh man. Man, you know, I already know. Listen, I don't even need to talk about it. We all know what people are going to comment. You know, people, listen. S tier. Charizard is an S tier deck. There's nothing you can tell me. There's literally nothing you can tell me, especially now after winning the Ursa Days 1800 player tournament this past weekend. Charizard is an S tier deck. Listen, you can disrespect this deck all you want. You can look at the overall win rate. You can see that we're not good against a lot of decks in the format. You can see that Hitmonlee does body us. Yes, Moltres is weak to electric. Magnezone is everywhere. It does not matter because listen, there's nothing better. There's literally nothing as strong in the entire game as a turn 3 Charizard with 6 energies onto it, which isn't very likely, but it does happen. It can happen, and trust me, when it does happen, you've lost the game. There's nothing you can do about it. 180 HP is crazy. Nothing that early in the game is able to KO you. We're KOing anything in the game, 200 damage, absolutely ridiculous. Listen, Charizard is Charizard, and it's always going to be an absolute threat. If we're talking about like a deck in terms of its viability, in my mind, I'm talking about a deck about, you know, like the potential. You know what I mean? Like, listen, I love playing Pachirisu EX. I think Pachirisu is really great. It's got a much higher win rate than Charizard does on average. But Pachirisu has not won anything. It's never going to really win anything because it doesn't have the upside that Charizard does. I'm going to eat my words. Pachirisu will probably win next week. But you get what I'm saying. Charizard has the highest potential. It's got the highest strength, the best, strongest attack in the game. It's not very consistent, but it doesn't matter because it can always beat anything. That's where Charizard shines. I have to put Charizard in the S tier. I'm going to get flack for that. I already know, but I just don't care. I really don't. Charizard is an S tier deck, and this is my final tier list for Spacetime Smackdown, and I feel good about it. I do. This is my opinion. This is where I rank basically every prominent deck from this format. Again, if there was a deck or a deck that wasn't on here that you think should have been on here, comment below, but realistically, I put all of the decks that anyone really plays competitively in the tournaments on the tier list, and this is where I'm ranking them. This is my final meta tier list of Spacetime Smackdown, and I feel really confident about it, and I feel really good about it. Next up, I guess what we're going to do is kind of put them in order. So this video has already been really long. I do apologize for it. There will be timestamps and all that good stuff, but you know what? It is what it is. I wanted to at least just get all my final thoughts out there about this current format. So I'll be right back. I'm going to organize this tier list, put everything in order, and yeah, then we'll wrap up the video. I'll see you in just a second. All right, guys, we're back, and this is my tier list in order. So this is my definitive final rankings for all of the best decks from the Spacetime Smackdown format. Take a good look at it. Disagree with me, comment below. Let me know what I put in here incorrectly, what you would have changed. You know, be civil in the comments, but definitely let me know your opinions. I really do appreciate you guys watching. And yeah, don't forget to like the video and subscribe here. Exeggutor Celebi, the #1 deck of the game. I do think that Darkrai Magnezone has really cemented itself as that other top deck in the format. And then followed a little bit closely behind by the Skarmory decks, the Palkia decks, and the Charizard decks, all really top tier contenders in my opinion. Everything in the A tier here, I did put them in order, but really anything in the A tier can beat any other deck. They are extremely good. I think that they just haven't done enough, really, in my mind, or had a high enough win rate for me to put them in the S tier. B tier as well. These are sort of the decks that are really on the fringe. The decks that, you know, can do well. They're going to sneak their way into top, you know, day 2 or top cut sometimes. But really kind of a little bit below, I would say, all of the decks in the A tier. And then in the C tier, these are kind of the really rogue decks that, you know, again, do see some play, but really never do that well. And then we have the D tier, which are just Mewtwo and Mesprit, just decks that aren't really real contenders in the format. But that's it, guys. That's a long video. I apologize. The last tier list of the format. This is my final Spacetime Smackdown tier list. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. I really do appreciate it, guys. Have a good one. Next week when we do our tier list, we might do just sort of something different. We're not a meta deck tier list because this will be the last one. We might do like an EX Pokemon tier list or just something like that. But yeah, anyway, peace out, guys. Have a good one. We'll see you guys next time. And yeah, bye.